Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
The Liberal Prime Minister has lost control of spending, and he's lost control of his own cabinet. The outgoing Finance Minister promised that a massive $40 billion deficit would be her fiscal guardrail, but it looks like the Prime Minister and the incoming Finance Minister, carbon tax Carney, are pushing her through the guardrail and over the fiscal cliff with the rest of Canadians. So will the Prime Minister stand up today and admit that he's having his outgoing Finance Minister take the fall so that he can replace her with carbon tax Carney?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
They are trying to distract from their voting record, Mr. Speaker. In this House of Commons, when this government put forward legislation, affirmed last night by the Senate, in fact, to cut GST for families looking to buy kids' clothes, diapers, car seats, families that want to go out to a restaurant, someone who wants to buy beer or cider. They're against that, Mr. Speaker. Lots of slogans when it comes to cutting taxes, but that's all they have, Mr. Speaker. Empty slogans. When it comes down to it, we put a tax cut forward, and they voted against it.
Right on. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
A tiny 2-month tax trick is not going to help the more than 2 million Canadians lined up at food banks every month, or pennies off of Pepsi for Canadians who are going to pay $800 more for groceries in 2025. So this Prime Minister is forcing his outgoing Finance Minister to take the fall for the effects of his inflationary spending that's pushing his $40 billion deficit guardrail right to past and over the cliff. So will the Prime Minister admit that it is in fact his inflationary spending that's the cause of this massive deficit?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of Housing.
The lowest debt and deficit in the G7, Mr. Speaker. A 5th consecutive interest rate decline. What is that? That is good news, Mr. Speaker, for business owners looking to expand. It's good news for mortgage holders looking to renew, families looking to buy a home, Mr. Speaker, and there's many other examples. They want to distract from their record. In fact, think about the Harper years. The worst rate of economic growth had Stephen Harper going back to R.B. Bennett in the 1930s, Mr. Speaker. They're not serious about these things.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Good news. He's talking about good news like Canadians have never had it so good. The highest household debt, because Canadians can't afford to pay their mortgages, they can't afford to feed themselves, they can't afford to heat their homes or put gas in their cars after 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister who said that the budget would balance itself, that he doesn't think about monetary policy and it should be the bankers that worry about the economy. Even his caucus is calling for some fiscal sanity after 9 years of his economic vandalism. When the deficit smashes through $40 billion, will at least he allow his caucus to have a free vote?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
He talks about people at food banks, Mr. Speaker. We're not insensitive to that. Canadians have had a hard time. What has this government done? We've supported them through the pandemic. We continue to show support, Mr. Speaker. They want to cut their pensions. They want to cut employment insurance. We have a school food program, in fact, that is supporting no less than 400,000 kids in 4 different provinces. They voted against that too, Mr. Speaker. The Canada Child Benefit, today parents will see a direct deposit put into their account. Guess what? They're also against that, Mr. Speaker. They don't care.
Yes.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Deficit, that's a very short 3-syllable word. It's easy to pronounce, and yet not only are the Liberals incapable of saying it, they won't even talk about it because they've lost control, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance said that she had put in place a guardrail so that the deficit would not go beyond $40 billion. So why is the Prime Minister being advised by Mark Carney? Why is he choosing to force her to blow through her $40 billion guardrail and break her promise? The Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, Canadians and Quebecers will have a GST holiday. That is great news. And what did the Conservatives say? They said that they had to cut taxes, but they sat down And tomorrow morning, we took action. We are going to give a GST holiday to Canadians on diapers, on restaurants. Mr. Speaker, Canadians will be able to save money because of us. The Conservatives don't get it. The Honourable Member for Edmé-Gontier-Clairade. I didn't hear him mention the word deficit, Mr. Speaker. I said deficit. It's not hard to understand. Why did the Prime Minister force the first female Minister of Finance to blow through her guardrail, taking with her all Canadians over the fiscal cliff, while he and his friend Carbon Tax Carney watched them fall? That is such hypocrisy from a Prime Minister who said this week, well, I want you to know that I am and always will be a feminist. I'm going to try again. Does the Prime Minister have the courage to say the word deficit? And why did he force his Minister of Finance to break her promise? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I saw the Conservatives' economic statement, and it's blank. They have nothing to say about the economy. Early tomorrow morning, we're going to give a GST holiday to Canadians, and that's good news. They could have stood up and supported us on that. And what did they do? They stayed seated. So they are going to have to tell their constituents why they didn't support this holiday. And that is shameful, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Once again yesterday, the senators delayed a crucial vote on C-282 on supply management. They have been engaging in shenanigans for the past 18 months instead of adopting this one-section bill. Instead of respecting the will of all parties, the unelected senators are obstructing and filibustering. And, irony of ironies, they took 4 hours of paid breaks yesterday. Will the government denounce this sad spectacle? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with the member across the way. It is shameful what the Conservatives are doing in this House, because some 50% of them voted against Bill C-282, and on this side of the House, we have supported that bill, and so I encourage all members to work on this to get the bill to pass. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. I am calling on all party leaders. Every single one of them voted to protect supply management in trade agreements. So today, they now have the responsibility to call on senators to respect the will of elected officials. They have to tell the unelected senators that they're not paid to take breaks, that they have work to do, even though it is very superfluous. The Lords of the Senate will be sitting again next week. Will all the leaders, especially the Prime Minister, call on them to pass Bill C-282 before the holidays?
The Secretary Parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The past few months, I have heard the Prime Minister say on a number of occasions he was encouraging the other place to adopt C-282, but I didn't hear the same thing from the leader of the Conservative Party. I know it's rough on that side of the House. Half of them voted against supply management, but everyone on this side of the House voted in favor, and we expect that the other place respect the wishes of the House of Commons.
New Westminster, Burnaby.
The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer revealed yesterday that over 2 million Canadians don't have access to adequate or affordable housing. No surprise. Average rents now in the lower mainland of British Columbia for a one-bedroom are over $2,500 a month. Staggering. The Liberals have simply been too weak to take on the corporate greed that is fueling housing prices. And Conservatives, of course, they will just make their corporate landlord buddies and developer buddies richer. But when will this government take on the corporate greed that is fueling housing prices, and so that all Canadians can have a roof over their head?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
In fact, what the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report revealed, Mr. Speaker, is that this federal government, for the first time in decades, is back in housing, making it a serious priority, reversing decades of cuts of previous governments in particular, and with all due respect to Conservative governments. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have more work to do. What we've seen through vital programs that would be cut by that party like the Reaching Home program, 87,000 people lifted off the street, and almost 150,000 people who are going to be homeless, not homeless because of our strategy on that. We'll continue.
Right on.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Temperatures are plunging in northern Canada, and the ongoing housing crisis on northern reserves is putting families and children at serious risk. Carol Ann Ballantyne lives in a moldy trailer with 3 children in Pelican Narrows, Saskatchewan, and for years she's pleaded just for a simple home to keep her children safe and warm. But to the Liberals, she's just another name on an ever-growing backlog of heartbreak and homelessness in the north, a crisis they continue to ignore. So, simple question, why is this government refusing to help this family? Why are they refusing to step up and deal with this crisis?
The Honourable Minister, Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been working since 2015 on creating partnerships with provinces, with territories, with Indigenous leaders to get more houses built all over the north, Mr. Speaker. Several years ago, we invested $4 billion in distinctions-based housing to get construction done. Last year, there was another $4 billion for an urban, rural, northern housing reserve. We're going in the right direction, and there's still lots of work to do.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Carbon tax Carney's Canadian comeback fueled a fiscal feud for this furious finance minister. The Prime Minister forced the finance minister to crash through the $40 billion deficit guardrail promise. The PBO says it'll be at least over $6 billion. Now that the Prime Minister is done using her, he'll dump her for carbon tax Carney. Will the Prime Minister confirm once he fires his finance minister, the deficit won't be a penny over $46 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While that member practices on things that rhyme with F words, our minister actually renegotiated NAFTA with Trump. Our minister introduced supports during a global pandemic to keep businesses and people going. Our minister tomorrow will see a GST tax breaks for Canadians. So while Conservatives practice their rhymes, we're delivering real supports for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Their minister is the reason why Canada's economy is crapping out. And just to take dimes off of Doritos, they'll crash the deficit guardrail, taking Canada's finances off a cliff. The Prime Minister forced the Finance Minister to implement it. The PBO confirmed that they're already $6 billion past that fiscal guardrail. Canadians want to know how bad carbon tax Carney and the Prime Minister will smash through the $40 billion deficit guardrail. How bad is it? What is the deficit number?
What is it? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear that when the Conservatives have no real argument or debate, they just insult people. Because on this side of the House, our finance minister has a record of helping people in some of the hardest times that this country has ever faced. A global pandemic, global inflation. We saw another interest rate cut just this week, and tomorrow we will see more tax breaks for Canadians. Something Conservatives promised they'd do, but weren't able to. So what is it, Mr. Speaker? Is it the fact that it's our plan we're actually implementing, or they can't stand it's a woman doing it?
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peter. Order. Order. We made it into 12 questions before we really got too much noise here. Not bad, not bad. This is a record, I'm sure. This must be a record. The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Consensus among economists, experts, and even the parliamentary budget officers is that this government has exceeded all of its fiscal anchors. The only question is, how badly have they failed? Can the government confirm whether the Minister of Finance has gone way past the guardrails, or whether they've gone completely off the cliff with a $46 billion deficit?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
The members should expand beyond the Fraser Institute, Mr. Speaker, and look to, for example, what the International Monetary Fund has said, what other lead financial authorities have said in the business press and elsewhere, the parliamentary budget officer as well. Canada has a very sustainable fiscal situation, the lowest debt in the G7, the lowest deficit in the G7, a AAA credit rating, Mr. Speaker. And what do we see on the Conservative side? a plan to make cuts, including a plan to cut $10 million for housing in Peterborough, his community, Mr. Speaker. What do you have to say to that?
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Well, let's return to the facts here. The current and former Governor of Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, and Steve Pelosi agree the Canadian economy is in big trouble. The phantom finance minister's economic plan is failing Canadians. The sad part is these Liberals don't even know how badly. So can someone go behind the curtain on the other side and simply ask Carbon Tax Carney what the deficit is?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I know this member, he's an honourable member, and I know that he cares about his community. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Peterborough's Mayor Jeff Leo, a good man, someone who cares about his community and is doing a great job in that city. I told him about the government's plan to invest over $10 million through the Housing Accelerator Fund to build more housing. The Conservatives want to cut that investment, among others. Will he join the other Conservative MPs who are advocating for the Accelerator Fund to ensure that more homes get built? I hope that he does, Mr. Speaker. The Mayor's asking.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has lost control of his spending and his cabinet. The PBO says that this year's budget deficit could be as high as $46 billion, smashing the $40 billion guardrail promised by the Finance Minister. And like so many ministers before her, this Finance Minister's time might be limited simply for standing up to the Prime Minister and his radical agenda. Will the Prime Minister confirm that he is ignoring his Prime Minister's $40 billion guardrail promise and tell us if the deficit will exceed $46 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Throughout today, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have launched personal attacks on the Finance Minister, who's responsible for, among other things, the Canada Child Benefit, who's responsible for, among other things, ensuring that child care is a priority in this country, moving towards $10 a day. What has that done in this country for its economy? Among other things, 110,000 women have been able to re-enter the workforce because childcare has now moved to an affordable level. They want to cancel that, Mr. Speaker. They say all these things about families. In the end, they don't care about families, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, from that answer, it's clear that the Liberals have abandoned all hope of keeping their $40 billion guardrail promise that was made to Canadians. While the unelected, unaccountable, and phantom Finance Minister, Carbon Tax Carney, pulls the strings from the shadows, the Liberals are following their Prime Minister and the economy of Canada right off the fiscal cliff. Already, interest charges on our debt will cost taxpayers more than the feds send to the provinces in health care. So will the Prime Minister confirm that the deficit will not be over $46 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, you know, there's some really good news. Last night, the Senate of Canada passed the legislation that's going to give a GST tax break starting tomorrow for all Canadians in all regions of the country, Mr. Speaker. That is actually good news. That is something in which the Conservatives campaigned on, but oops, they actually voted against it, Mr. Speaker. They're the Grinch of Christmas, Mr. Speaker, whereas we are giving a tax break during the holiday season. That is good news.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Berchères. Mr. Speaker, time is running out for Lion Electric and the federal government must step up. Lion has until December 16th to meet with its lenders. That's Monday. The federal government, December 16th. The federal government must send a clear message to the investors that everything is in place for Lion to resume its activities. It must tell potential buyers that electric school buses that they will receive their 50% subsidy as provided for. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with the province. We'll continue to work with investors. We will do everything we can because this is an industry that is the future of Canada and Quebec. We absolutely want it to work. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Berchères. I would have liked to have heard yes instead, Mr. Speaker. Lion employees deserve better than that from the federal government. There are 3 days left to save this Quebec flagship of green transport. Investors, the city's concerned, the governor of Quebec, everyone is fighting to save Lion. But in the meantime, there's just Ottawa that is asleep at the switch. The federal government must facilitate the awarding of the full amounts of the subsidies. That is its role, and it has to do it now, not when there won't be any more of flagship. Will they step up? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, through our zero-emission public transit fund, the government is helping public transit manufacturers to serve Quebecers and Canadians. This is a good way to tell school bus operators that they will be available, and we know that we will continue to work. We want to save these jobs. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Calgary Heritage.
$40 billion was a guardrail set by this Liberal finance minister. Listen to this. Not an unlimited pot. Need to show fiscal restraint. If we have $40 billion guardrails, stay in there. Mr. Speaker, that's not Stephen Harper. That's Liberal members of Parliament. If the deficit is over the $40 billion guardrail, will the Prime Minister allow free vote for his NDP Liberals?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Housing and Communities.
The members opposite are very fond of quoting from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mr. Speaker, as is their right. Well, they can go one step further and actually look what he recently said on the country's finances. We have a more than sustainable fiscal situation. But if it was up to the Conservatives, that would reverse. We know what the Conservative record is when it comes to running up deficits. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, to the point that's been raised, because they talk about families, what programs would they cut? They talk about this idea of fixing the budget. For them, that means cutting. And they would cut dental care, they would cut pharmacare, they would cut support for families across the board, and pensions, Mr. Speaker. They're not serious.
That's right. The Honourable Member for Calgary Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about what could be more than $40 billion. A carbon-taxing, coal-loving Carney, a finance minister on the run, a prime minister not into monetary policy. They hike taxes, they fuel inflation, they crash through the fiscal guardrails and off the cliff. This government is a chaotic clown show. Which one of them will call a carbon tax election?
Just to make sure everybody's, just watch the words that they use. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we see the Conservatives dive into insults because they actually have no plan for the economy. And I think they just can't stand the fact that we have a finance minister who was able to renegotiate NAFTA with the previous Trump administration. We were able to see supports being delivered to businesses and Canadians through the worst global pandemic. And, Mr. Speaker, we continue to see interest rates drop. And tomorrow we see a tax break for all Canadians. So while they want to know about a free vote, I'm wondering if they'll have a free question.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has lost control of his finances and of his cabinet. This spat is about the astronomical deficit, because the Prime Minister is forcing his Finance Minister to increase the deficit by $6 billion for electioneering purposes. He forced her to not keep her promise, to not blow through her $40 billion deficit. Will the Prime Minister confirm that the deficit will not be beyond $56 billion? Thank you. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in my riding, it is the distribution of Christmas baskets, and I'd like to thank all the volunteers and Solange, the General Director, for their excellent work. When I meet with them, they always remind me how important it is for families who receive the Canada Child Benefit, and that is an excellent, it's some $7,000 per person, and we are so thankful for our Minister of Finance to have put that in place. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the facts. 9 years of Liberal government, 9 consecutive deficits. The result, the debt of Canada has more than doubled. Even the Minister of Finance is starting to quarrel with the Prime Minister because of his irresponsibility. Mr. Speaker, to solve this spat, the Prime Minister is preparing to crown the very radical Mark Carney. He's been pulling the strings for far too long. So, is this Minister of Finance on her last legs? And will she replaced by Mark Carney, who is unelected?
Secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank all the volunteers in my riding who are helping those who are in need, including and we have to say that, our Deputy Prime Minister has given us a GST tax break that the Conservatives voted against. I would urge my colleagues across the way to meet with their constituents and tell them that they voted against this tax relief measure for those people who are in need. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, postal workers have been left without a fair deal for too long. They deserve safe working conditions, to retire with dignity and livable wages. Now small businesses and everyday people are being hit hard, all because the Liberals refuse to do right by workers. And the Conservatives, well, they don't care about workers. They protect CEOs like Canada Post's Doug Ettinger, padding his pockets while workers and communities struggle. Why is the minister refusing to protect postal workers' rights to a fair deal?
Here, here. Honourable Minister of Labour.
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, we did respect and do respect workers' rights to negotiate a collective agreement. That's why the government has proposed, and I have proposed, a way forward where we can avoid these postal workers being on picket lines for an untold and unknown amount of time, take a pause, have an independent, respected arbitrator look at the situation, propose a way forward, and indeed ensure the sustainability for Canada Post. We will always be there for postal workers and other workers, Mr. Speaker, and we need to make sure that Canadians are well served in the process.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, Port Alberni is short 1,200 homes. It's nearly impossible to find an affordable place to live. Rents doubled under the Conservatives and then again under the Liberals. Liberals' disappointment and Conservative cuts mean that non-market housing in Canada has dropped to 3.5% of our housing stock. Other countries are doing much better, like France at 17%, Netherlands 34%, and Denmark at 21%. Safe, secure, and affordable housing saves lives. When will the Liberal-Conservative coalition stop caving to rich investors and rapidly start building up Canada's non-market housing supply?
Here, here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
The member is right to talk about non-market housing. We do need more non-market housing options in this country, Mr. Speaker. And what have we seen over the past few years? An enormous increase in exactly that. 87,000 people who were on the street are now living in non-market housing, Mr. Speaker. Close to 150,000 people who are going to be homeless have been housed as a result of the investments that this government has made. We agree with the NDP that we need to do more, of course, but Mr. Speaker, where we part company with the NDP is on the issue of market-based housing. We want to see more rental apartments for middle-income and lower-income Canadians. The NDP doesn't have a plan on that.
That's right. The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, our government announced new measures to put more money back in the pockets of Canadians to help them afford the things they need and save for the things they want. Unfortunately, some on the other side of the House are spreading misinformation about our tax cut, like the Member of Parliament for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, and Nicola, who described it as sending people pennies. Could the Minister please educate the member opposite on what a tax break means for Canadians this holiday season?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me commend the member who comes from a proud family that built up a successful small business. She understands what this tax cut means for small business owners, but also for Canadians who want to see a savings, especially during the holidays, one that begins this Saturday and extends into February. What do we see with the Conservatives? Sloganeering. Their leader isn't too worried. He has a $2 million pension, Mr. Speaker. He's not worried at all. Conservatives talk about tax cuts. When it comes down to it, they're not in favor of that. They don't care.
That's right. The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
The final
Minister admitted that deficits cause inflation. She promised that she would cap Canada's deficit at an already crazy $40 billion and wouldn't go a penny over. Now the Prime Minister is pressuring her to spend even more by pushing through her own guardrail and making her fall off a fiscal cliff. Is the Prime Minister going to pressure this female finance minister to read Conflict of Interest Carbon Tax Carney's fiscal update and blame her for breaking the $40 billion deficit promise?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I repeat the lowest debt and deficit in the G7. The PBO coming out and affirming that we have a very fiscally sustainable situation. What would the Conservatives do? They would make cuts. And in fact, the member, with all due respect to her, ought to go and listen to what the mayor of Kelowna recently said. The Conservatives are proposing cuts for housing. That would mean less money for Kelowna. In fact, he's worried that because of those prospective cuts, that Kelowna would have to increase property taxes and go into the reserves. The Conservative plan is a plan to increase property taxes, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've seen the fake feminist Prime Minister do this before, pushing strong women out of cabinet. Yet the Prime Minister's hypocrisy is on display as he lectures about him being a proud feminist. The Globe and Mail reported on the Prime Minister's aggressive recruitment of conflict of interest carbon tax Carney as tensions increase with the current finance minister. So will the fake feminist Prime Minister park the hypocrisy and admit his inflationary spending is forcing the finance minister to break her $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we hear the word feminist being thrown around this place in the most disrespectful way, and it is rich that the Conservative Party claims to care about women. Maybe they should stand up to their own leader who contributes to the misogyny that increases hate towards women by embedding misogynistic hashtags into his YouTube videos. We won't take any lessons from the party across.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
The finance minister actually admits deficits cause inflation. She promised a cap of an already wacko $40 billion, but the Prime Minister bullied to crash her through that so-called guardrail with billions more. He sets her up to take the fall, and Canadians will pay the price. Now, like a long line of women, the Prime Minister kicks her to the curb for his conflict of interest carbon tax crony Carney. Is the Prime Minister really going to bully his female finance minister to read carbon tax Carney's fiscal update and then blame her for breaking the $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, this is a minister who stood up to Putin, who renegotiated trade deals with the U.S., who worked and helped Canadians get through a global health pandemic. Mr. Speaker, she doesn't get bullied, but it seems that perhaps the Conservative caucus is projecting the fact that if they don't read the Conservative leaders' lines, if they don't rhyme enough, they don't get question time. So while we are working and focused on providing tax relief to Canadians, Conservatives are making sure they rack up those gold stars.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Look, we all know the Prime Minister says women experience him differently, but it's his pattern to elbow them to the side, and it's sad to see a woman spinning for him. He's incompetent, unaccountable, and bullies subordinate women, blames and shames them, then replaces them with his buddies. He's aggressively recruited carbon tax Carney, yet calls himself a proud feminist. Canadians can't afford this. Will this complete weak fake stop all the hypocrisy and admit his inflationary spending forces the finance minister to break her $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Minister.
If the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, want to talk about feminism, here's some policies that our government has done to support women across this country. Policies like $10 a day childcare that has thousands of women back in the workforce because they can now do so. The National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence that is helping women get true freedom from those that would hurt them and harm them. True freedom, autonomy over our bodies, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives have opposed every single measure we have put forward to help women in this country, and they continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start by expressing my solidarity to the workers at Canada Post. I hope that an agreement will be quickly negotiated, but this proves that we very much need a 10-day passport collection service at Abitibi-Témiscamingue in northern Quebec and on the north coast. In urgent situations, people in my area have only one option within Quebec, which is to drive for 6 hours or more in the dead of winter to Gatineau or Montreal. But at the Service Canada office in Rouyn-Noranda, they have all the equipment that they need to offer the service, and they've had it since September 2023. It's almost the holidays. Will the minister finally show some good faith and offer the service in Rouyn-Noranda?
Secrétaire parlementaire.
Merci, monsieur.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, I'd like to thank my colleague across the way for wanting to improve Service Canada. Service Canada is currently working with IRCC in order to explore all possible ways to expand the current services. When they determine a location, it's based on various criteria, like access, the demand, and demographic factors. We're always seeking to improve things, and only on Tuesday we have a meeting on that subject with the minister. The honourable member. Well, the minister dared to formally respond to me that 96% of Canadians are able to access the 10-day passport service within a half hour of their homes, but in my area people need to drive more than 6 hours, 2 or 3 days, plus fees. In the dead of winter, people are having to drive for hours over very long distances. It's ridiculous. We have heard that the equipment has been there for 15 months. We just need to train the staff. When will the Liberals stop keeping our citizens waiting like this? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that more than 98% of people are able to access these services, but in his writing, 92% of passports are deliverable within 20 days in his writing. Now, I would also invite people to also plan for their trips and to ask for their passports more than 20 days in advance in order to be able to meet their needs. And we're continuing to work with Service Canada, IRCC, and service centers to improve service.
Bull River.
Thank you. Things are getting real bad behind closed doors for the languishing Liberal government. The Prime Minister is once again looking for someone to take the fall for his fiscal fiasco. This time, the Minister of Finance has been targeted for removal, so carbon tax Carney can come out from behind the shadows and replace her. Their $40 billion so-called deficit guardrail looks like it's about to be smashed through, sending our economy off the cliff. Will the Prime Minister keep his promise, confirm the deficit will not be over $40 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
More personal attacks today, Mr. Speaker. Under this Minister of Health and under this Minister of Finance, we've seen a national dental care program put in place. 3 million plus Canadians have signed on. Over 1 million have received care, Mr. Speaker. Many are seniors. In fact, seniors were the first to be offered care. Are the Conservatives saying that as part of this big, bold idea, more of a slogan, Mr. Speaker, in fact, to fix the budget, they'd get rid of dental care? Yep. That's exactly what they would do, Mr. Speaker. When it comes down to it, as I've said throughout today, they do not care. They care about slogans, but they don't care about Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Bull River.
The Prime Minister lost control of his caucus, just like he lost control of our economy. And their benches are clearing of people left to blame. But it's not stopping the Liberal government from smashing through their own stated deficit guardrail, their fiscal anchor. Whatever they want to call it, the guardrail is about to be smashed. Canada's economy is careening off the cliff and sinking fast. So will the Prime Minister please just stop drowning us in debt, confirm the next week's deficit, and won't shoot over $40 billion and capsize Canada? Here.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, children's clothes, diapers, car seats, board games, prepared food, snacks, video games, children's toys will all cost 13% less tomorrow in Ontario, thanks to our GST tax break that our Liberal government brought forward. Well, the Conservatives sat down and voted no against this tax savings for Canadian families. We understand that this time of year is hard on families. We want to continue to be there to support them. If you're planning on taking your family out for dinner, that's 13% less in Ontario. That's what we'll continue to do. We'll continue supporting families in Ontario. So starting tomorrow, there'll be a GST tax break for all families across Canada.
The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has lost control of spending and even his own cabinet. He is pushing his finance minister to smash through her $40 billion deficit guardrail. All the while, reports indicate he is planning to fire her and replace her with carbon tax Carney. Now, Mr. Speaker, $40 billion would already be a massively irresponsible deficit, but the PBO says it could even go as high as $46 billion. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister confirm today that the deficit will not be a penny over $46 billion?
Great question. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I think we sit in this place and we hear Conservatives ask the same question written by their leader over and over and over again. That question has been asked and answered dozens of times in this House. So I have a question for my Conservative friends back. They seem very concerned about deficits. Can they offer one thing? One. Where are they going to start cutting, Mr. Speaker? Be specific.
The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, in 2022, 1 in 4 Canadians skipped a visit to the dentist because of cost. But thanks to our government's Canadian Dental Care Plan, over 1.2 million Canadians have now received oral health care. Applications for the Canadian Dental Care Plan launched 1 year ago, and today, more than 3 million Canadians now have dental coverage, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of Health share how the CDCP is making life more affordable and helping Canadians access essential dental care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, I thank the member for his question. He's been such an advocate and a proponent of making sure everybody gets oral health. And could you imagine just a year ago when we started taking applications on the Canada Dental Care Plan, that in that year now 3 million Canadians are covered. It means virtually every senior who is eligible is covered and is able to get care. That is not just a matter of social justice, of somebody having a smile they're proud of, or finally being able to get a pair of dentures in their mouth. It is also a matter of prevention. When we make sure that people get care, they don't get sick, we save money, and we have a healthier society.
The Honourable Member for Caribou Prince George.
They launched dental care just about the same time that they take the GST off chips, cookies, and candies. Bravo. Liberal backbenchers have supported this Prime Minister through every scandal and every failed policy. Their deficit must be pretty bad if they're finally willing to remove the gag and start speaking out. Will the Prime Minister at least listen to his own MPs and allow a free vote?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, let's talk about health. Let's talk about what they're going to cut. They would take away diabetes medications for patients. They would take away contraception for women. They would take away oral health care for seniors. And what's going to happen? Let's talk about the implications. Canada has the second longest health span in the G7, longer than Italy, longer than France, longer than the United Kingdom, 6 years longer than the United States. What they would do with these cuts is drive illness, which will drive cost, and is just plain dumb. If you want to make sure that we get health right, it also is at the core of a strong economy. It's at the core of reducing costs. It's time they woke up and stood up for health care in this country.
The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
The fundamental role of Parliament is that no money shall be spent without the consent of Parliament. It's right in the Constitution. You might want to take a look. It's been 8 months since the year end, and the Liberals still haven't tabled the deficit number. The Liberals are 2 months late in tabling the public accounts. Bay Street, not Parliament, learned yesterday that the government has sold $3 billion of Air Canada shares. They are blocking Parliament from doing its work. They must have blown by their maximum $40 billion deficit promise massively. Come clean. What's the deficit number?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing and Communities.
The member knows very well, Mr. Speaker, that during the pandemic, this government provided loan support and other support for Air Canada to ensure its long-term viability. Part of that was buying shares in the company. It was never, though, the intention of the Government of Canada to hold on to those shares into the long term. It made a sale yesterday, and it was a responsible one. Again, and the question has been asked. The Minister of Health put it forward. The Minister of Labour put it forward. What would they cut? What would they cut to ensure that the budget, as they say, is fixed. They cut dental care, child care, pharmacare supports. They don't care, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Today, the Minister of Labour stepped into the Canada Post strike. The workers' union said, and I quote, "It denounces in the strongest terms this assault on our constitutionally protected rights." Even the NDP leader said the Liberals will, and I quote, "always step in to make sure unions have no power." On Monday, the NDP leader put his pension before country and workers and voted confidence in the Liberals. Will the government confirm it has ordered workers back to work? And what is the price Liberals paid to keep NDP leader propping up this anti-worker government?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, we acted decisively today to offer a creative solution to the labour dispute between Canada Post and its workers. That constitutionally protected right to strike has been exercised for 4 weeks. If workers were not to be on picket lines for some indefinite period over the holidays, a solution had to be brought. We work for all Canadians in this House. Canadians were suffering. Small businesses were suffering. Indigenous and remote regions were suffering, Mr. Speaker. The government had to act, and that's what I did this morning.
The honourable member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, our government is bringing real tax relief to Canadians. Tomorrow, December the 14th, Canadians can celebrate the holidays without having to worry about the extra cost of the GST. This is a big help for Canadians across the country who will be able to keep more of their hard-earned money. However, Conservative MPs voted against this tax cut. Could the minister explain to my constituents how this measure can alleviate their tax anxieties during the holiday season?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Kitchener South Hespeler for that question and for her dedicated service. Our government believes that when Canadians need a helping hand, the government must be there. And that's why starting tomorrow, we are giving Canadians a tax break, putting more money in their pockets. This means that essentials like groceries, snacks, kids' clothing, diapers, all tax-free. It means Canadians can focus on this very special time of year on the holidays, spending time with family and friends, and worry less about family budgets. This holiday season is not a time to play politics, it's a time to deliver for Canadians.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals' short-term GST holiday is creating too much confusion for small businesses across this country. This botched plan is adding more stress on local store owners at the busiest time of year as they scramble to reprice their inventory only to swap back in February. Thankfully, New Democrats have a plan to make things simple. Let's make the GST cut permanent on life's essentials so Canadians can have more money and businesses know what to expect. My question is, will this government make life easier for everyone?
Hear, hear.
The honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, good news. Our government is delivering Canadians a GST tax break starting tomorrow, December 14th, and this is going to really benefit retailers as well as consumers. Let's listen to what the Retail Council of Canada said. This break will create major tax savings for Canadians along with economic stimulus for our industry. Restaurant Canada called this a big win for the restaurant industry and predicts that our tax break will boost sales by 5%, bringing restaurants $1 billion of additional revenue. This tax break will bring more people into the doors of these small businesses. We're grateful to be providing this break for Canadians.
The honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, today the Canada Post strike is a month old and there's no end in sight. This essential service to small businesses is absent during critical sales period needed for their survival. Two obstinate groups hold Canada hostage while the Liberals, desperate to cling to power, are afraid to lose NDP support by ending the strike. Both should know that there are no workers to unionize or taxpayers to tax without employers. And this government's failure to act is harming Canada's top employers and our economy. Mr. Speaker, will the government do its job, put Canada first, stop hiding behind...
Sorry, everybody. I don't know who this guy is, but I like him because he's wearing a Canadian pin. Look at everybody else. They're either wearing watermelons or Ukrainians or something else. I like this guy. Canada first, always and forever. Like and subscribe, everybody, please. Support the channel.
...the CIRB and end this strike.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Well, the job of the Minister of Labour is to respect the Canada Labour Code. That is exactly what we've done, and today I acted decisively.
Yes, I know this guy's wearing a Canadian pin, but this guy's also an idiot. I don't like him.
Use one of the powers granted to the Minister of Labour by this Parliament under the Canada Labour Code to provide a reasonable solution to workers and a creative way out of this very fundamental impasse that we see at the bargaining table. We're going to return Canada Post services to Canadians and to those who've been suffering over this conflict, and hopefully arrive at a negotiated collective agreement by the spring, Mr. Speaker.
And that's all the time we have for questions.